Welcome back, everyone. We are gathered once again all together in one big session, and I sincerely hope you were able to take some valuable insights from the virtual classrooms. Now it's time to introduce Simon Anholt, who will deliver the keynote address on the implementation of environmental, social, and governance strategies. Simon is a founder of The Good Country and an independent policy advisor. He has advised over 53 world leaders and their cabinets, as well as dozens of CEOs of global corporations. All of this on how to develop and implement strategies for their enhanced economic, political, or cultural engagement with other countries and global publics. Simons, I'm very curious, so please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Ralph, and it's really a pleasure to be here. I promised I wasn't going to talk too much about the pandemic, and I also promised I wasn't going to talk too much about the Climate Change Summit. But for somebody like me who's interested in humanity and the planet, and I'm sure you all are, you're all interested in that as much as I am, it's irresistible, because it's so rare really in our modern world, even though we're heavily globalized, to have opportunities as good as this to observe the entire human race acting and interacting together as one. So a few references both to the pandemic and to the COP, but I promise it won't dominate what I'm talking about. The pandemic, if it doesn't sound too cynical of me to say it, is really quite interesting because I think it's helped us in a critical way at a critical moment. And why do I say that? Well, for the reason I mentioned before, because the pandemic has really shown us all in a very dramatic way that we really all are in one boat. We really are one species inhabiting a single planet, facing the same challenges. And that's important because it's so very rare, almost vanishingly rare, for us to get that sensation. But over the last year or two, anybody who has any access to any form of media, and that's most people in the world, as they look at their phone or their TV or they listen to the radio, they can see other people so different from them and yet so similar to them, suffering in such different and yet such similar ways. Suffering, losing, fearing, caught up in the same anxiety. And if that doesn't make you think to yourself, truly we are one species, then it's quite surprising. I think ever since the modern human story started and we walked out of the Great Rift Valley all of those tens of thousands of years ago, and stopped being a single tribe facing a single set of challenges, the story of human ingenuity since that time has been a story of us trying to get back together again and to be once again a single tribe facing a single set of challenges. And the extraordinary thing is that we've achieved this. Today in the 21st century, we really are at least capable of being a single tribe facing a single set of challenges. The only difference now, of course, is that those challenges are all challenges that we've created all on our own, and we've made our bed and we need to lie in it. So in a sense, the pandemic occurring as it does in this year, in these years, marks the zenith of that process of globalization, that ultimate connection and interconnection and the creation of such high levels of interdependency between all the peoples of the world. And I think that's been useful to us, because unless we're in that frame of mind, unless we accept that we are one single race inhabiting one single planet, there's no way on earth we're going to be able to get our heads around climate change or to tackle it effectively. Because as long as we're all still convinced that the world is just a disparate group of nations, individual separate islands inhabiting their own private oceans, then we're never going to be able to understand the reality of climate change. And not just climate change. I'm talking about all of the global challenges. The Sustainable Development Goals is the United Nations way of looking at it. Now, the SDGs, as you know, there are 17 of them. I've always seen the SDGs as being 16 doors and one key. And the one key is SDG 17, the need for cooperation and collaboration. I'm going to come back to that later on, but it's really important to state upfront and serious that almost every single one of those global challenges, and climate change is no exception, are far too big for any one country to solve on its own. So cooperation and collaboration is more than just a battle cry. It's a simple functional necessity. Unless we work together, we can't fix any of these things. And the pandemic is excellent proof of that. And climate change is excellent proof of that too. Sometimes looking back at human history, it seems as if the only time we ever really managed to get our act together and to think of ourselves as a single tribe is when we're faced by a common enemy. And that in our heavily globalized world is relatively unusual. And in a sense, that's what the pandemic has done. It's interesting that Donald Trump tried in many different ways to characterize the virus, the COVID virus, as being an enemy, an invisible enemy, a tiny enemy that we had to face together. And there's actually quite a lot of sense in that because, as I say, historically, we have shown ourselves to be much quicker at acting together when we perceive that we're faced by a common enemy. Somehow or other, climate change has never really been very successful in fulfilling that need for us. We don't yet recognize it as the common enemy of all humanity. And that's because it's impersonal, it's invisible, it's in some respects quite slow moving. It's very difficult to perceive it as such. And maybe that's the main reason why we haven't been very effective at mobilizing ourselves collectively against the threat of climate change. I often think that the only time when human beings ever really do feel the sense of there being a collective shared enemy, and thence, for that reason, of feeling like we all human beings are one group working together, is when we see movies like Independence Day, where there really is an overwhelming enemy stacked up against us from another planet. And there's a precious moment when the people leave the cinema in the afternoon, blinking in the sunlight. And for a moment there, they were rooting for the humans, and we felt like one. Perhaps climate change, perhaps the pandemic are somehow beginning to be the equivalent of Independence Day or these other disaster movies, that they can help us to configure it in that necessary way so that we can perform the necessary functions and view the world in that necessary framework in order to get together and act. Just one more thing about the pandemic, which I think is important to add, and I did promise I wouldn't go on and on about it, but it has also shown us the need for some humility. It's shown us very dramatically and very starkly that we human beings, Homo sapiens, have no special dispensation to survive. There's nothing clearly written in the book of destiny or in the makeup of the planet that says that humanity must survive or will survive or should survive. In fact, quite the opposite. And what the pandemic has shown us is that we could be wiped out from one moment to the next. It really is possible. And that, I think, that sense of realistic vulnerability, humanity, has been very, very useful in the sense that it's helped perhaps to break down something of our complacency. Complacency has always and often been the greatest obstacle to human progress. Humanity has a tragic habit of leaving things until the 11th hour and the 59th minute before it sees the need to change, and it changes. And of course, the problem with climate change, and particularly atmospheric CO2, is that the 11th hour is already too late. We are already too late for climate change. Not too late to do something about it, for heaven's sake, but too late, clearly, to prevent it because it's with us already. But that sense of complacency is momentarily in abeyance. We shouldn't be feeling too complacent right now. So for heaven's sake, let's not waste a good crisis. The desire, the intense desire to return to normality, to go back to the way that we were before, which is so powerful and so understandable, is beginning to reassert itself. And we see examples of it every day. And we have to fight that and not waste the moment. Part of that, I think, has a lot to do with how we communicate the risks of the future to each other, to ourselves, to society. And I don't want to spend too long on this, but there is a tendency, and I've noticed it over and over again, even at the COP during these last few days, to try to panic people into changing. And I think that we know by now that that doesn't really work. It's not very good psychology. Al Gore, somebody who's done quite a lot for the cause of climate change, for a very long time, behaved like an Old Testament prophet, thumping the Bible and prophesying floods and famine and disaster if we didn't repent of our evil ways. And that doesn't really work, because at heart, fundamentally, we're all still children, and we don't like hearing things that we don't like hearing. And if we have a terrifying prophet like Al Gore prophesying a terrible future, we have a tendency to stick our fingers in our ears and say, no, 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 I can't hear you, because we don't want to listen to that stuff. What works far better is, if you like, not the Gore approach, but the Churchill approach. Some of you may possibly be familiar with some of the speeches that the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill made in the darkest days at the beginning of the Second World War. And he didn't try to make people frightened about what was coming. He tried to help people to see beyond the dark days that were coming and to look to some kind of beautiful, peaceful future when our troubles would be behind us. In other words, what he did was to use a very modern expression, he tried to brand a perfect future. And branding a perfect future is very much more likely to bring people with you than terrifying them about an imperfect future. The trouble in the end is that I think all of us feel so disempowered, we feel so useless. Even at the level of corporations, we tend to feel a little bit useless. We tend to ask ourselves, how much good can I actually do when I'm carefully avoiding using plastic drinking straws, or I'm carefully recycling my garbage? It's still little old me versus great big world. And is all of that worth even doing? Isn't that act of recycling just in the end an empty gesture? Is there any point in even doing it because it's so tiny? Well, maybe it is. Let's be honest, maybe it is, to all intents and purposes, an empty gesture. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it. And I do believe that the reason why we continue to carry out these gestures, even when they do seem to be only gestures, is because they have a function which we sometimes don't really fully appreciate, which is a communicative function. In behaving in the right, sustainable way, we are communicating to people around us that that's the right thing to do. And it's one of the well-known facts about the human tribe, about the human animal, is that we are herd creatures. The only time we ever change is when we're convinced that everybody else around us is changing. We have to have a sense of change occurring before we will start to change ourselves. Now, that may sound like a catch-22 situation. It may mean that nobody will ever change because nobody ever changes. And yet, if some people do change, then others begin to change too. We're a little bit like animals walking down to the river, wanting to drink. No matter how thirsty those animals are, nobody wants to be the first one because it's risky. So I think that sense of change is a very important thing for us all to keep promoting and keep acting out, remembering that we are helping, we are doing good, we are creating an environment where ultimately everybody will change. And perhaps the implication of that is that even greenwashing, which has come under a lot of criticism this week, quite rightly so, is a bad thing. Of course it is, but it's not entirely useless, as long as it's not the majority of companies or individuals or governments, of course, doing it. But a minority who are greenwashing, who in other words feel that it's necessary to make the gestures of sustainability, even if for whatever absurd reason they're not able to do it for real, that's still helpful, because it still helps to persuade all of us that these are the behaviors that are required of us. This is the way we need to be in the 21st century. And this is the way that society wants us to be. So even greenwashing perhaps shouldn't be dismissed quite as aggressively as we tend to do at the moment. Of course, we need to take those greenwashers and show them the difference between greenwash and really sustainable behavior. But the fact that they even think it's worth pretending is significant and quite interesting. So let me take a step back at this point and look on a slightly bigger picture. I mentioned before that all of the global challenges that humanity is facing in the 21st century, all of the sustainable development goals, they are too big for any individual country to solve on its own. America can't solve climate change. China can't solve pollution. The European Union can't solve the problems around migration. Unless we work together, we will achieve nothing. The problem is that the world is still divided up into nation states, just over 200 of them. That's the way that we're configured. That's the way we run ourselves as a species. And that, for the time being, for the foreseeable future, is the way that we're organized. and there's a problem with the culture of national governance. Ever since the Treaty of Westphalia was signed in the 1680s, indeed long before, it's always been the basic fundamental premise of governance that you are responsible for your own people if you're a leader, and you're responsible for your own slice of territory and literally nothing else. You should focus on your own people and your own territory. And if, in attempting to do good to your own people and your own territory, you accidentally do some harm to other people or other territories, that's just fine. We forgive that. It shows what a tough and uncompromising leader you really are if you're prepared to hurt other countries' people in order to benefit your own people. My argument is that in our highly globalized and deeply interdependent modern world, surrounded by existential challenges, that fundamental principle, that mandate of power, has to be revised and it has to be reviewed. So this is what I call the dual mandate. And I would argue that today, in the 21st century, anybody with any power or authority, whether that's civil, national, political, social, cultural, it doesn't matter, has a dual responsibility. They are responsible for their own people, their own stakeholders, their own citizens, of course, but also for every man, woman, child, and animal on the planet to some extent, whether they like it or not. And they are responsible for their own slice of territory, their own factories, their own land, of course, but also, to some extent, for every square centimeter of the Earth's surface and the atmosphere above it and the ground beneath their feet, whether they like it or not. And if they don't like it, they shouldn't be in a position of power or authority because of this interconnectedness, because of the interdependency of all of us. That, I think, is the new rule of governance for the 21st century. And the art of good governance, again, whether we're talking about nations, cities, regions, companies, institutions, it hardly matters. The gold standard of good governance today is the ability to productively harmonize your domestic and your international responsibilities, your local responsibilities and your global responsibilities. If you can do the right thing for your own people and your own slice of territory, whilst at the same time doing no harm to anybody else or anywhere else, then you're on the road to doing very, very good governance indeed. And if you can go further than that, do the right thing for your own people and benefit people outside your own borders, then that's where we should all be aiming. And I guess the thing that I spend a lot of my time trying to get across to world leaders is that those two things, contrary to what they imagine, are not contradictory. Doing the right thing for your own people and doing the right thing for people in other countries is not a contradiction. It's not a compromise. And I'm certainly not asking nations to sacrifice themselves for the benefit of other nations. That would be absurd. The idea of a nation state that voluntarily sacrifices its own interests for the benefit of a needier nation, that's preposterous. I mean, again, I'm quoting Donald Trump a lot today, but when he said America first all the time, there was nothing surprising or shocking about that. Of course, America first. If you're elected to be the president of a country, of course you put that country's interests first. Duh, as Homer Simpson would say. What was sad, I think, about Donald Trump's vision, as I understood it, was that he felt that America first meant that every other country had to come last. And that's the thing that I dispute. And that, in a sense, was the tragedy of Donald Trump's presidency, because America, of all countries, has been the one that perhaps has tried hardest and most consistently over the centuries to demonstrate that you can aspire to be first as a country, and still it's in your interest to help other countries try and come first too, first equal. And the same rule, of course, applies to companies. You don't need me to tell you that. So I think that this harmonization of domestic and international responsibilities, of local and remote responsibilities, is, as I say, the absolute key to it. But the big discovery is that when you start experimenting in that way, you start attempting to mingle your domestic and your international requirements and obligations, what you begin to find is that it doesn't actually narrow your options at all. It doesn't actually leave you with fewer choices for policies and innovations and projects. It actually widens it. The moment you start thinking about responsibilities as well as opportunities, and the moment you start thinking about other companies and other societies as well as your own company and your own society, a magical thing happens. You suddenly discover that you have more options. You have more creativity in the mix. Framing every domestic issue as if it were an international issue, asking yourself, how similar is this to the challenges that they're facing in Sierra Leone or Guatemala or Iceland? Suddenly, that brings more inspiration into the whole governance process. Again, whether it's corporate governance or national governance, it brings more creativity into the mix, and you suddenly discover that you're on the verge of a whole world of policy making that perhaps you never even dreamt of before. Put simply, the reason why countries and companies need to cooperate and collaborate more is not because they'll go to heaven if they do it. It's because it's in their direct, immediate economic interest to do it, because they'll make better policy, they'll do better business. And most importantly of all, it also has an extraordinary effect on their image. And I'm going to finish off by talking just for a moment about brand image. I think that in this world that we're facing, this world of intense corporate cooperation and competition combined, a couple of things really stand out. Some things that have been developed really to quite a high standard in the private sector, but are still largely unknown in the public sector, and also vice versa. I think there's a lot of public sector practice that I've come across in my work as a government advisor, which would be extraordinarily useful for corporations. I often find myself, when I'm talking to large corporations, wondering why they don't, for example, have a foreign minister. In many cases, there's a stronger argument for some companies having a foreign minister and perhaps a diplomatic service than there is for certain countries. But in the other direction, it's even more interesting. What is it that the private sector, corporations, have that they could usefully teach governments so that governments can help us turn COP26, for example, into a successful rather than an unsuccessful episode in human history? And I think there are three things. I would suggest that the first one is the notion of co-opetition. Some of you may remember this curious word, which emerged, I think, back in the 70s, and it came from the automotive industry, primarily from Japan. The idea that within a given industry, it was possible for competitors to collaborate. We're not talking here about illegal cartels. We're just talking about friendly collaboration, the rising tide that lifts all boats within a given industry. And the automotive industry still does that, as do many others to this day. And the lesson from that is that it works. When you work together with your competitors, it's a trick to get it right, but when you do it, it benefits you, it benefits them, it benefits consumers, and it benefits the whole industry. So co-opetition, the blending of competition and collaboration, is not only essential for the future of the planet, it's also an experiment which is about 40 or 50 years overdue for the majority of national governments. And one of the things I spend my time doing at the moment is urging governments to learn this lesson from industry and give it a try, because the effect is often magical. The second lesson I think that corporations can teach governments very usefully is what we used to call CSR, corporate social responsibility. Today, the phrase gets sneered at. I'm not particularly interested in which phrase we use for it, but the idea behind it is a very simple one, that corporations, companies, have a duty to provide their employees and all their other stakeholders with purpose, as well as an economically productive activity. And that's part of the way in which they deserve the space that they occupy on the planet and the privileges that they enjoy within society. CSR as a phrase amuses me, because when consultants coined this phrase a few decades ago, they sort of wanted to give the impression that they just invented this idea. Well, I wrote a book many years ago in which I claimed exhaustively and elaborately in the first chapter that CSR had actually been invented by the Medici family in Italy in the 12th century. I mean, as long as people have been in trade, they've understood that your good name is the most precious asset you have. And your good name cannot be built by propaganda and messaging. It can only be built by demonstrating your moral purpose and your values to others. And if people trust you, then they want to work with you, and they want to work for you, and they believe in what you do, and they prefer your products. And this is absolutely, of course, fundamental to business and always has been. And that's why the whole fascinating area of brand and brand theory and brand strategy has been so important a part of marketing disciplines and corporate disciplines since almost the beginning of the industrial era. It's something that countries don't fully understand very well. Now, as it happens, countries are my subject, and I've been measuring the images of countries since 2005. I publish an annual study called the Nation Brands Index, which measures the brand images of countries. And I did an analysis of the cumulative database of this big survey back in 2012. The database had collected over 1 billion data points by this stage. And I wanted to find out from this database, what does create a good image for a country? Because there's no question that for a country, having a good image is just as valuable as it is for a company. If you have a good image, then everything is easy and everything is cheap. If you have a bad or a negative or a weak image, everything is difficult and everything is expensive. So where do national images come from? And what I discovered through doing this analysis of the Nation Brands Index data was a rather surprising fact, that by a very, very wide margin, the most significant driver or predictor of a positive national image is the perception that your country contributes something positive to the world outside its own borders. It's a good neighbor. It's got not CSR, but GSR, governmental social responsibility. In other words, if people feel glad that your country exists, they are much more likely to invest in its economy, to visit it as tourists, to buy its products and services even at a larger margin, to hire its talent, and so forth. So again, the argument that came out of this analysis was very strong and very powerful. I could go, and I do every day, to leaders all around the world and say, the reason why it's necessary for you as a country to start doing good things for the environment, good things for human rights, good things for poverty, good things for inequality, good things for disarmament, is not because you'll go to heaven if you do it, but because it's in your direct, immediate, short-term economic interest. If you do that, it will improve your brand. And if you improve your brand, you will be a stronger, faster growing, more secure, more admired, more respected, more listened to country in the community of nations. So that principle of brand value feeding directly into business performance is perhaps the most precious lesson that governments can learn from corporations. And they're taking a really, really long time to learn it. But one of the things I said, nearly 20 years ago now was, if the governments of the world put even half of the value onto their good names as corporations do, then the world would be a much quieter and much more stable and much more peaceful place than it is today. So roll on the days when governments begin to understand that measuring and managing and cherishing the national brand, not through wasted money on communications and propaganda, but through demonstration of your values, is the way forward for countries. The sooner they realize that, the better things will be. The last thing only takes a second to say, but it's a really important one as well. Companies understand the value of creativity. They understand what it means to be innovative and why it's important to do things that are different from the things that people have seen before. And again, this is something that governments are quite bad at. The people who work in government face every day this difficult situation of being responsible for the lives and livelihoods of millions of people. So it's a very serious job that they have. But the normal response that policymakers have to that seriousness is to become boring. They do policies that as closely as possible resemble the policies that have been created by people just like them in situations just like this in past times, because that looks reassuring, or that's what they think. In fact, this is completely the wrong thing for them to do. It's the worst thing for them to do, because policies that are boring, policies that don't capture people's imagination, policies that aren't somehow different and exciting will not capture people's minds and hearts, and therefore will not produce any change. So companies have a lot to teach governments about the power, the unique value of creativity and innovation. So here we are almost at the end of my talk. Here we are looking towards the end of COP26. And how can one summarize all this? Well, I guess perhaps the thing I most feel like saying is, look, this is COP26. The politicians have now had we've given the politicians 26 really good chances to save the world. It looks very much as if 26 wasn't enough. So how many will be enough? I think now, after COP26, is the moment when all of us really have to step up to the plate and finally acknowledge that in a very serious and very formal way, not an informal or voluntary way. It's going to take companies and people, society too, not just governments, to produce the huge changes that we urgently need to see. Which is another way of saying that we need to grow up. We need to grow up and finally abandon the illusion that the adults, the politicians, are going to sort things out for us, because clearly they're not. And we're expecting far too much of them if we think that they can. The systems are wrong, the people are wrong, the electoral processes are wrong, the situation is not the right one for this. We're the adults now, all of us, companies and people. Is this a moment, perhaps, when humanity finally grows up? Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Simon, for these very, very inspirational thoughts, applicable not only on governments, but indeed, I believe that the principles of brand values that are already known by companies, it wouldn't be bad to have a double check for companies to say, okay, are we doing there what we promised to our customers, or is this exactly the brand that we want to be? So very inspiring for all of us. And ladies and gentlemen, now I really would like to invite you to join us for the final session of today, where my colleague Sergio will deliver a final remark, some few remarks, and then we have an interactive session with a very impressive mentalist. To join the session, please click on the Sessions tab on the right side of your screen, or again, go to the Agenda tab in the navigation bar. You will find the session immediately, register and join us. Thank you and see you soon. Bye-bye.